Hello, everyone, and welcome to Archie Viking. Today is the official 14th video and unofficial 10th video of my series on the early imperial expansion of the United States. The subject of today's video is what I am calling the Phoenix of the Southern Appalachians, the Cherokee Nation in the early imperial United States. Now, I'm sure a lot of people on the eastern seaboard in the eastern part of the United States are at least a little bit aware of the term Appalachian, or for those of you who are further up north, Appalachian Mountains, a long mountain range that stretches roughly from the eastern part of Mississippi all the way up to the southern part of New York, that encompasses parts of Georgia, Alabama, and North Carolina, Kentucky, etc. Now, obviously, as I always like to point out, uh, in our modern minds, whenever we hear about geographic locations like, say, the Appalachian Mountains, we tend to think of the political borders as they are, i.e., for example, the borders of each of these states, Georgia, Alabama, South Carolina, etc., as they are today. Because obviously the Appalachian Mountains have been here for millions of years. Now, of course, that's not an incorrect picture to look at it. After all, the states in the United States have taken on these borders and had these borders for about 150 or so years now. However, this was not always the case. This is not the full picture. The states within the area that is known as Appalachia or Appalachia only took on these borders after a long series of events, conflicts, and catalysts. So, in order to get a better look at the larger picture, we need to go back a little bit further in time. Starting with the origins of the ancestors of the Cherokee in the late archaic early woodland period transition. First, we need to define the terms that I mentioned, late archaic and early woodland. So the late archaic period, and really the archaic period as a whole, was a time period in which the ancestors of the Native American peoples, such as the Cherokee, were beginning to settle down into, if not completely permanent villages and towns, at least semi-permanent villages and towns. And they also began to adopt new technologies such as pottery. However, they were still predominantly living a hunter-gatherer lifestyle, meaning they had not adopted agriculture yet. They would gather like wild vegetables and wild nuts, and would hunt, of course, wild game like deer, or as you can see in this picture here, would collect fish. And the early woodland period was the time period in which the ancestors of Native American peoples, such as the Cherokee, settled down into completely permanent villages and towns and adopted agriculture, and actually began to develop some degrees of uh, social hierarchy, though, of course, those evidence of social hierarchy is found in the archaeological record dating to the Archaic period and before, but this is where social stratification in the early woodland period really began to sort of develop. And so the late Archaic, early woodland period transition is, well, as the name suggests, the transition period between these time periods, where it wasn't quite the archaic, it was sort of the end of the late archaic, but it also wasn't quite the early woodland period yet, but it was getting there. Um, Agriculture, say, hadn't been completely adopted yet, but the first sort of inroads to adopting agriculture were beginning. And it is believed, based off of the archaeological evidence, that this is the time period in which the Cherokee people, or the ancestors of the Cherokee people, began to uh, rise as a distinct cultural group, as an ethnogenesis, if you will. And the evidence for this is discussed in this paper by Thomas R. White, titled Proto-Iroquoian Divergence in the Late Archaic-Early Woodland Period Transition of the Appalachian Highlands. And what Thomas R. White looks at in using archaeology is he looks at one, the linguistic evidence, the molecular evidence, and of course the material culture, such as the similarity between points, projectile points of, say, the Haudenosaunee, or more commonly known as the Iroquois, up in the New York area, versus the points of the peoples of the Southern Appalachians, such as the Cherokee. He also looked at paleoecology and subsistence methods, and mortuary behavior. And so what he found, and you can pause to read, is that based off of the evidence, uh, the Cherokee people, or the ancestors of the Cherokee people, diverged from the ancestors of the Haudenosaunee, or more commonly known and more incorrectly known as the Iroquois peoples, the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Cayuga, Onondaga, um, and the Oneida, uh, is that this split between those peoples happened sometime in the late Archaic, around 4,000 years ago, or 4,500 years ago, give or take. And White suggests that the reason that this divergence happened during this period of time was that at the start of the late Archaic period, 4,000 to 4,500 years ago, the Appalachian mountain chain supported a relatively homogeneous mass of forest adaptation from one end to the other. And that essentially it was out of this adaptation that the ancestors of the Cherokee and the Haudenosaunee, the Iroquois ancestors, again, that's an incorrect term to call them, but it's the most common term people know them by, the Mohawk, the Seneca, the Cayuga, etc., the Onondaga, that it was out of this adaptation that these two groups split. And that it also may have been that the mountains, as well as competitive neighbors, may have provided a geographic insulation necessary for this linguistic divergence. He also goes on to state that around 3,800 to 3,500 years ago, the Appalachian Highlands were characterized by heavy dependence upon upland forest mast. The projectile point distributions trended along the Appalachian axis. There was also evidence of significant participation of Appalachia in a wider regional economy that involved the export of valuable and geographically restricted lithic, stone tool, and perhaps subsistence resources, as well as the fact that the possibility of violent competition for control of these resources, as evidenced by the introduction of the bow and arrow, may have also played a role in that, on top of the fact that there was seemed to have been, based off of the mortuary evidence, a preference for cremation of the dead. He also goes on to explain that while an adaptive pattern appears to unite much of the Appalachian region during this period, the late Archaic, The common linguistic source for the Cherokee and the Haudenosaunee may have consisted of several smaller allied groups or tribes restricted to a much smaller subregion, or that Proto-Iroquois may have spanned, the ancestors of the Haudenosaunee may have spanned a greater part of the Appalachian chain and controlled and maybe even sometimes distributed by trade its lithic materials, its stone tool materials, and other resources. Or perhaps they resided in the Appalachian region well before the late Archaic and or had moved into the region during the late Archaic to control the aforementioned lithic resources. Um, Furthermore, soapstone may have become integral in their ethnic identity. Also, perhaps interregional conflict over these resources, or say competition from the outside, or simply acquiescence to the soapstone technology and mast forest adaptation to the ceramic and horticultural waves of the future brought on the ultimate fissioning and gradual distancing of the ancestors of the Cherokee and the ancestors of the Haudenosaunee peoples, and that this may have begun somewhere around 3,700 years ago, as estimated by the linguistic distance, or perhaps the divergence coincided with the breakup of the late archaic Appalachian economy somewhat later, um, because while ceramics predate soapstone vessels in the lowland southeast and northeast, the importance of the soapstone vessel diminished with the adoption of ceramic technology in the Appalachian economies after 3,500 years ago. And that societies occupying the uplands gradually gave into the more sedentary life and an increasing dependence upon horticulture, probably through interactions with the lowland societies, both east and west of the Appalachian Mountains. He also points out that there is evidence that interaction within the Appalachians continued in the woodland period, albeit to a lesser extent. And this is readily expressed in the material culture, uh, as seen, for example, in the early woodland Swannanoa. I'm sure I butchered that, and Vignette One ceramics. And also that migrations and expansions and displacements of people certainly continued through the remainder of Eastern North America during the pre-contact period, thus bringing Northern and Southern Iroquois, that is the language family that the Cherokee and the Haudenosaunee speak, bringing the Northern and Southern speakers of this language to their observed historical ranges, separated by 500,000 linear kilometers of mountain range and innumerable groups of Algic and Siouan speakers. And then he finishes by stating that debates over migration versus in situ development, in which archaeological evidence is associated with what language in this period of time, will probably continue in both the Northeast and the Southeast. But the archaeological, linguistic, molecular, and other evidence supports the hypothesis that the Cherokee and other Proto-Iroquois, again, the language family, Proto-Iroquois speakers had their homes in the Appalachians, and they began to diverge in the late transitional archaic period. And then this brings us to our next part, the ancestors of the Cherokee in the Mississippian period. Starting with, of course, the Mississippian culture. So the Mississippian culture was a cultural group and a civilization that began in North America with the rise of the city Cahokia somewhere around 900 CE and what is now the border of Illinois and Missouri. And with the rise of the city, its culture would very quickly begin to spread throughout the uh, eastern woodlands, uh, as you can see here on this map. With Cahokia having the height of its sort of influence and hegemony, the height of it itself as a metropolis of around 20 to 50,000 people between 900 and 1350 CE. And the ancestors of the Cherokee are specifically connected to multiple Mississippian cities in southern Appalachia, as discussed by Benjamin A. Steer in his paper titled Revisiting Platform Mounds and Townhouses in the Cherokee Heartland, a Collaborative Project. And uh, in this paper, Steer specifically looks at these counties that you see here in western North Carolina, looking at various time periods and various archaeological sites, as you can see here, with the earliest ones going back to the early Pishka period of the Mississippian period, um, looking at the Tuckasegee, Pigeon, and French Broad areas, as well as the Hiwassee and Little Tennessee areas. And then he also specifically looks at these Mississippian cities here, these Mississippian mound sites, if you will. And as you can see here on this map, several historic Cherokee towns are located in the exact same areas as several of the Mississippian cities within western North Carolina. And this makes sense because the ancestors of the Cherokee would eventually live in the late Mississippian Joara, Coosa, and Chiska chiefdoms, which rose and had the heights of their hegemonies, their political power, between 1000 and 1670 CE. And you can see all of these chiefdoms here. Here is Joora, Chiska, and the Coosa chiefdom. And again, here you can see that in much more detail with the ancestors of the Cherokee uh, living right here in these areas. Which leads us to the first contact between the Cherokee and Europeans, or the ancestors of the Cherokee and Europeans. So the first context between the ancestors of the Cherokee and Europeans happens during the DeSoto expeditions into the southeast, led by Hernando de Soto, uh, who traveled through various different Mississippian chiefdoms, including the the chiefdoms of Joara, Chiska, and Coosa. After the De Soto expedition, another Spaniard by the name of Juan Pardo would launch another expedition into specifically the Joara chiefdom, where he would again encounter the ancestors of the Cherokee as well as other Native American nations, such as the Catawba, and would negotiate, uh, to get permission to build multiple forts within the Joara chiefdom. And this would happen between 1566 and 1568 CE. One of these forts was a fort by the name of Fort San Juan, which was built right here in western North Carolina. And, for a while, there was some degree of peace in these forts, as evidenced by the archaeology work of people such as Christopher Rodney and David Moore. And within the archaeological evidence, you of course, you find various different examples of weaponry, as you would expect from a military fort, such as powder for harquebuses, lead, crossbow bolts, etc. But you also find evidence of various different trade items in other European items, such as olive jars and glass beads, uh, uh, various other items such as iron nails and things such as that. And here's some more examples of the olive jar fragments and the lead shot that, the lead balls used for arquebuses that have been found at the Berry site. And of course, uh, iron nails and brass aglets as well. However, this peace would not last, as sometime in 1568 CE, members of the Jora chiefdom, including the ancestors of the Cherokee, would attack and burn down all of Pardo's forts and would kill all of the conquistadors garrisoned there, with the exception of one who would be sent back as a warning uh, to Juan Pardo. Now, what I mean by that is this is a little bit speculative, but the records by Juan Pardo state that this Spaniard supposedly escaped and traveled only at night and hid during the day. However, uh, having had conversations with uh, Rodney and Moore about this. Both of them believe that this is very unlikely given the size of the Jora chiefdom and the number of its warriors, uh, and also the fact that this individual also came back with a Native American wife who may or may not have been the daughter of the chief of the Jora chiefdom. So, while it doesn't outright state it in the records, uh, both Rodning and Moore tend to agree that the most likely scenario is that the chief of the Jor chiefdom let this individual go, perhaps because he was married to his daughter, um, to go back and warn Juan Pardo to essentially never come back to the Jor chiefdom. But again, that is speculation. However, despite this victory over the Spaniards by the Johora chiefdom, the Johora, Coosa, and Chisca chiefdoms would eventually collapse due to population decline from European diseases such as smallpox, as well as the rise of new political entities um, such as the Cherokee Nation. And this happened somewhere around 1670 CE. Which leads us to the rise of the Cherokee Nation. So, after the collapse of the Johora, Chisca, and Coosa chiefdoms, the Cherokee Nation would rise in parts of Georgia, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, Kentucky, and Virginia in the early 1600s CE. Uh, and then fairly quickly after this, they would come into contact with more Europeans, specifically the British. And this would happen because one, the colony of Virginia had been founded uh, early in the 1600s and had begun to really take off as a major political entity by the 1670s. And then, because of that, of course, the colony of Virginia would send British fur traders to Cherokee territory to establish trade relations between the Cherokee and the British Empire somewhere around 1673 CE. And then after this, the Cherokee Nation and other Native American nations would become major participants in the deerskin trade, which lasted somewhere between the early 1670s to the early 1800s CE. And they would also become major participants in the Native American slave trade, often participating in raids on rival Native American nations such as the Appalachians to capture prisoners to sell into slavery in Carolina. At the time there was a single colony of Carolina. There wasn't North and South Carolina yet, and the West Indies. And this again happened somewhere between the early 1670s and ended specifically in 1717 CE. And the reason for this is because of two major events. First, the Tuscarora War, which was a war started uh, by the Tuscarora Nation against the British Empire, because the Tuscarora, who themselves had been major participants in the Native American slave trade, began to realize that they would eventually become essentially the next victims in this slave trade. And of course, there's more complexity to that. I've already done a video, in-depth video on the Tuscarora War that I will include in the iCard. So of course, like as I said, there is more complexity to that, but generally, when you get down to the sort of nitty-gritty, the Tuscarora started the Tuscarora War because they did not want to become victims of the Native American slave trade. And for a while, they were winning against the British. However, eventually, several different Native American nations, including the Cherokee Nation, would go on to help the British Empire win the Tuscarora War. And this war happened between 1711 and 1715 CE. And then, pretty much immediately after this, the one of the other Native American nations who had allied with the British, the Yamasee, as well as the Muscogee Creek Confederacy, would realize, much like the Tuscarora, that hey, we're going to become the next victims in the Native American slave trade if we are not careful and we don't do something. So they all decided to go to war with the British Empire. And again, much like the Tuscarora War, the Yamasee and the Muscogee Creek, among other Native American nations, were actually winning the war until the Cherokee Nation and other powerful Native American nations, such as the Catawba, joined the British and defeated the Yamasee and the Muscogee Creek nations in the Yamasee War, with this war happening between 1715 and 1717 CE. As a result of both of these wars, the specifically the Tuscarora and the Yamasee Wars, the Native American slave trade would begin to be gradually replaced by the chattel slavery of Africans and African Americans. Hence why the Native American slave trade ended somewhere around 1717 CE. And again, I have done an in-depth video on the Tuscarora and the Yamasee Wars that I will include in the iCard. Right around this same time, Scotch-Irish migrants would begin to migrate into and settle in the American Southeast, as well as would begin to settle in several Native American nations, including the Cherokee Nation. Despite the Cherokee Nation having, a great deal of authority and a great deal of political and military power during this time period, the Cherokee Nation would not be able to escape many of the major epidemics of disease that would happen frequently during this time period, with the Cherokee specifically suffering from a major smallpox epidemic between 1738 and 1739 CE. In 1741 CE, 7 prominent Cherokee chiefs, including Atakulakula, would visit King George II in London, where they would sign treaties of peace and neutrality with the British Empire. Meanwhile, after the Yamasee War, warfare and sporadic raids between the Cherokee Nation and the Muskogee Creek Confederacy would continue for decades, culminating in the defeat of the Muskogee Creek Confederacy at the hands of Cherokee warriors led by Nancy Ward at the Battle of Taliwa in 1755 CE. And then shortly after this victory by Nancy Ward in the Cherokee against the Muskogee Creek Confederacy, the British Empire, at the request of the Cherokee Nation, would build several forts, such as Fort Loudon, in Cherokee territory, uh, with the goal of facilitating easier access to the deerskin trade. That was the primary reason the Cherokee wanted these forts to be built, was they were tired of having to travel all the way to, say, Charleston or Savannah to trade deerskins, and wanted, so of course they wanted something closer to go to in order to conduct this trade. And the construction of these forts happened between 1756 and 1757 CE. Then, just 1 year after the construction of these forts, the 7 Years' War would break out between the British Empire and the French Empire, among several other powerful nations and empires, as you can see here in this map. And during this conflict, the Cherokee Nation would temporarily side with the British Empire against the French Empire, specifically participating in the British attack on Fort Duquesne in 1758 CE. However, as I already said, this would be temporary. And that is because after the Fort Duquesne campaign, the Cherokee warriors, as they were returning to the Cherokee Nation, would be repeatedly attacked and robbed by settlers and militia from various British colonies, including Virginia, South Carolina, and North Carolina. Then, after these attacks, the several Cherokee chiefs would actually go to Fort Loudon and would demand compensation for the attacks on their warriors and the deaths of their warriors. But this would be a ill-advised idea, an ill-advised attempt, if you will, and that is because upon reaching Fort Loudon, the British Empire would capture and hold these Cherokee chiefs hostage. And then all of these events together would eventually lead the Cherokee Nation to declare war on the British, upon which they would eventually defeat the British Empire in the Anglo-Cherokee War, which I've already done an in-depth video on that I will link in the iCard. Now, I do have something that I do need to mention, as I mentioned, also mentioned in the video on the subject that I will link in the iCard. If you say Google the Anglo-Cherokee War and look at the Wikipedia page, it will claim that the Cherokee actually lost the Anglo-Cherokee War. However, if you actually look at the events and the battles, and sort of the play-by-play structure, if you will, of the Anglo-Cherokee War, uh, the Cherokee were the ones who actually won the war. They won all of the battles, suffered minimal casualties, and actually got what they wanted, which I will talk about in a minute. Now, it was a Pyrrhic victory, meaning a victory that was costly, and that's because much of their farmland was destroyed, uh, but it was a victory nonetheless. So, as a result of the Cherokee defeat of the British Empire in the Anglo-Cherokee War, as well as the stalemate that was Pontiac's War, the British Empire would create the Proclamation of 1763, forbidding British colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. Now, this map is a little bit of a it's a little bit of a misnomer. This boundary wouldn't have actually looked like this. It would have been a lot more fluid. Um, but generally, this is the idea of what the boundary or the proclamation was that British colonists could not settle west of the Appalachian Mountains, and the area west of the Appalachian Mountains would be quote unquote Indian Reserve. Which actually brings us to our next section, the Cherokee Nation and the United States. Now, obviously, the British colonists did not like the Proclamation of 1763 and would often break the proclamation or simply ignore it. One of these would be the founding of what would eventually become Kentucky by Daniel Boone and other British colonists who would convince several prominent Cherokee chiefs, including Atakulakula, to sell the Transylvania Company 20 million acres of Cherokee land in the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals, also known as the Transylvania Purchase in 1775 CE. And this would be an act that would actually not be very popular among many of the Cherokee and would actually lead to warfare. And that is because many Cherokee, specifically Dragging Canoe, the son of Atakulakula, would be angered by the Treaty of Sycamore Shoals, as well as the continued seizure of Cherokee hunting lands by British colonists in violation of the Proclamation of 1763. And so this anger would lead Dragon Canoe to gather several like-minded Cherokee warriors and chiefs, such as Ostonaco, Bloody Fellow, and Doublehead, and large amounts of Cherokee warriors to declare war on the British colonists in 1776 CE. And of course, because I'm sure many watching recognize that date, 1776 CE, it should come it's no surprise this will be at the same time as when the 13 British colonies and the British colonists would declare war on the British Empire in the American Revolution. During the American Revolution, the Cherokee, led by Dragon Canoe, would form an alliance between the Muskogee Creek Confederacy, which was currently being led by Muskogee Creek chiefs such as Alexander McGillivray, with actually Alexander McGillivray being sort of the one to facilitate, to a certain degree, this treaty and alliance, with said alliance joining the British Empire against the colonists. In contrast to Dragon Canoe's faction, the Cherokee faction, led by Nancy Ward and Atakulakula, would remain mostly neutral during the conflict. In fact, the neutral faction of the Cherokee would continue to cede lands to the colonists in several treaties, such as the Treaty of DeWitt's Corner in 1777 CE and the Treaty of Augusta in 1783 CE. Then, as many of us in America are aware, eventually the colonists, the United States, who would become the United States, would win the American Revolution. But despite this, Dragon Canoe's faction of the Cherokee Nation would continue its war with the United States going on to form a pan-Native American alliance against the United States, consisting of his band of Cherokee, the Muskogee Creek Confederacy, to a certain degree the Choctaw Nation, as well as the Shawnee and the Lenape, also known as the Delaware. Then, just 3 years after the end of the American Revolution, the neutral faction of the Cherokee would cede more lands to the United States in the treaties of Dumpling Creek and the Treaty of Hopewell. In 1791, Dragon Canoe's faction of the Cherokee would become founding members of the Northwestern Confederacy, which was also founded by the Haudenosaunee and the Miami and Shawnee, among others. And together with the Northwestern Confederacy, Dragon Canoe's faction of Cherokee would defeat the United States at the Battle of the Wabash River, also known as St. Clair's Defeat, in 1791 CE. However, just 3 years after this victory, the Cherokee-American War would begin to wind down into a stalemate, and would eventually end in a stalemate with the signing of the Treaty of Tellico Blockhouse in 1794 CE. Now, again, much like the Anglo-Cherokee War, if you look up this conflict on, if you Google it and look at it and say Wikipedia, it will claim that the United States won this war. But again, if you look at the series of events and the sort of in all the battles and the sort of blow by blow makeup of the Cherokee American War, it becomes very clear that this was a stalemate at worst. It essentially ended more akin to, say, the Korean War, if you will. And again, I have made a video on that I will link in the iCard. After the conclusion of the Cherokee American War, as part of his 6-point plan to civilize the southeastern Native American nations, George Washington would appoint Benjamin Hawkins as General Superintendent of Indian Affairs, dealing with all Native American nations south of the Ohio River, including the Cherokee Nation. Then in 1798 CE, the Cherokee Nation would sign the Treaty of Tellico, which renewed peace and declared that it would be perpetual. And it stated that treaties subsisting between the parties in full force, together with construction and usage under the respective articles, would continue. It would limit the boundaries of the Cherokee Nation to remain the same. Essentially, it would not be altered by the present treaty. The Cherokee Nation would relinquish and cede to the United States all lands within the following lines, specifically in East Tennessee. And also the line described in the treaty would be marked immediately, and it would form a boundary between the United States and the Cherokee Nation. The United States would guarantee to pay $5,000 upon signing the treaty, as well as $1,000 annually, in addition to previous stipulations of this kind, and that the United States would continue to guarantee the remainder of their country, the remainder of the Cherokee Nation's country forever, as made and contained in former treaties. The treaty also stated that the Kentucky Road running between the Cumberland Mountain and the Cumberland River would be open and free for the use of all United States citizens uh, until settlements make such hunting improper. The Cherokee would be permitted to hunt and take game upon the lands relinquished and ceded by this treaty. Also, due to the notice of to be given of the payment of the annual stipends, the United States would furnish provisions for a reasonable number of Cherokee who would assemble on these occasions. Horses stolen from the Cherokee people by white Americans would be paid for by the United States, and horses stolen from white Americans by the Cherokee people would be paid for by deduction from the annuity. And then also the agent of the United States residing among the Cherokees would have a sufficient piece of ground allotted for his temporary use, and the provision that this treaty would be carried into effect on both sides with good faith. Then, in 1804 and 1805 CE, the Cherokee Nation would cede land to the United States in three more treaties, also called the Treaties of Tellico, so that the United States could construct the Federal Road and the State Assembly of Tennessee in the territory of the Cherokee Nation. In fact, the Federal Road was actually supported by several prominent Cherokee leaders, including James Vann. Now, this leads us to our next section, the alliance between the Cherokee Nation and the United States in the War of 1812 CE. So, in 1812 CE, the United States would go to war against the British Empire. During this war, a sort of smaller offshoot conflict known as the Creek War, eventually the First Creek War, would break out when a faction within the Muskogee Creek Confederacy, known as the Red Sticks, would side with the British against the United States. With the outbreak of this war, the Cherokee Nation would form a military alliance with the United States, and many prominent Cherokee leaders, such as Major Ridge, would lead Cherokee warriors to fight side by side with the United States, and would actually play a major part in would play key roles in United States victories, such as the Battle of Horseshoe Bend between 1813 and 1814 CE. Just 2 years after the end of the First Creek War, and just 1 year after the end of the War of 1812, the Cherokee Nation would cede 2.5 million acres of land to the United States in the Treaty of Turkeytown in 1816 CE. Between 1816 and 1817 CE, prominent Cherokee, such as the Bull and Sequoia, would lead several groups of Cherokee west of the Mississippi River to settle in what would become known as the Western Cherokee or the Arkansas Cherokee Nation. However, fairly quickly after settling in this area, the Western Cherokee Nation would come into conflict with the Osage Nation, as the Western Cherokee Nation was encroaching on and stealing Osage lands, and this would lead the Osage to launch raids in an attempt to drive the Cherokee from Arkansas, starting somewhere around 1816 CE. Meanwhile, as part of the migration of the Cherokee bands west of the Mississippi River, the Cherokee Nation would cede lands fronted by the Sequatchie River in Tennessee to the United States in return for secured title to lands along the Arkansas and White Rivers in the Jackson-McMinn Treaty signed in 1817 CE. Land ceded by the Cherokee is this little gray area here. In a retaliatory attack against the Osage, 500 Cherokee, along with a number of Choctaw, Chickasaw, and white Americans, would attack an Osage village at Claremore Mound. They would then, in this attack, kill 38 Osage, including Osage Chief Claremont, and would take 104 captives. However, this did not end Osage raids on the Cherokee, as most of the village's Osage warriors were actually away on a hunt when their village was attacked. In response for the Cherokee attack, the Osage would eventually launch 2 decades of sporadic retaliatory raids on the Western Cherokee, lasting roughly between 1817 and 1839 CE. But this is a subject that needs to be covered in greater detail in the my video on the Osage Nation later on in this series. All right, now it is time to take a look at Cherokee society during this time period. So, for one thing, Cherokee society, like most Eastern woodland Native American societies, was a matrilineal society, meaning kinship was traced through the female line. A person would be identified with the mother's lineage, property would be passed down from the mother's family, and children would be born into the clan of the mother and take their social status from it. They were also a matrilocal society, meaning when a young couple married, they would live with the woman's family. Women were in charge of agriculture and harvesting the crops, as well as owning the agricultural fields. Now, biological fathers were important within this family system, but had to come from a different clan than the mother. And within the clan, it was actually the mother's brother, i.e., the mother's nearest blood relation, who would function as the primary teacher, protector, disciplinarian, and role model for children, especially boys. Clan members did not claim or did not always necessarily claim blood relation, but they considered each other as family due to their membership of the same clan. This would be expressed by their usage of the same kinship titles for both family and clan relations. For example, clan members of approximately the same age considered each other brother and sister, even if they had never met before. And then, of course, men were generally the chiefs and were in charge of warfare and hunting. And here are my sources that I got all this information from. Now, let us look at Cherokee warfare. So, for one thing, prior to the arrival of Europeans, warfare was infrequent. The archaeological record of the late woodland in Mississippi and Southeast does display a remarkable array of material cultural remains that are associated with warfare. However, this does not demonstrate how frequent the warfare was, just that it was present. Warfare was a very important way for men to gain social prestige. Warriors of higher ranking would be provided seating at council meetings. Women also held great authority in warfare, being able to lead war bands, as seen with Nancy Ward, and were the ones who decided whether captives would be executed or adopted into the family. Medicine bundles and rituals were essential to the success of warfare, and success in warfare allowed medicine to be used in positive ways which in turn led to the medicine becoming more powerful and more protective to the town. Furthermore, the success of a campaign was dependent on the successful completion of warfare-related rituals and ceremonies. Prior to the departure of a contingent of warriors to the field of combat, 2 to 3 days of rituals and fasting would occur, with these rituals seeking to cleanse and purify the bodies of the warriors to remove any distractions and evils, thus ensuring success in combat. Warfare would mainly consist of raids and ambushes, often focused on obtaining captives. Warriors would employ tactics and strategies such as frontal assaults, the use of fortifications for defenses, using horses for flanking maneuvers, the modification of natural environments into highly defensible positions, using rugged natural environments such as dense forests to both avoid and ambush enemy soldiers and warriors. And also, warriors would provide rearguard actions such as conducting leapfrogging cover during retreat. In response to the effectiveness of European artillery against the Tuscarora fortifications during the Tuscarora War, the Cherokee Nation would begin implementing guerrilla warfare and scorched earth policies as the preferred tactics against European and eventually United States armies, which they used to great effect. I.e., what would happen is they would completely abandon villages and leave them empty, um, which would often, to be fair, result in the villages being burnt. But it would also mean there would be no resources for European and United States armies to gather. And during that time, the Cherokee would disperse through the forest and would repeatedly ambush the United States and European armies from hidden positions, often taking very minimal casualties while inflicting very heavy casualties on these armies. That being said, there were ways to avoid war because oftentimes the Cherokee Nation and other Native American nations would use the game stickball as a substitution for war to settle disputes between nations and villages. The Cherokee Nation and other Native American nations of the eastern woodlands would also use stickball as a way to train young men in the ways of war because of its roughness and as a preparation for imminent wars and raids. Both of these practices would lead stickball to being called the little brother of war. Estimates of how many warriors the Cherokee Nation could field range as low as 3,000 to as many as 5,000, with a warrior to general population ratio of 5 to 1 at the lowest and 3 to 1 at the highest. And here are the sources I used to gain all the information. And here is a picture of what stickball would have looked like, or what a game of stickball would have looked like. Now we're going to take a look at what the Cherokee warriors look like and what the weapons they used look like in the 1800s CE. So for one thing, Cherokee warriors looked generally like some variation of this. Some would look something like this member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee in North Carolina, who is dressing up like a Cherokee warrior from this time period. Others would look something like this. And there would even be some variation in between these. But generally, these are a good sort of idea for what a Cherokee warrior might have looked like during this period of time. And the weapons that Cherokee warriors used included, well, for one thing, of course, the tomahawk. The tomahawk is one of the most well-known Native American weapons. However, it was not the only weapon they used. In fact, it's important to note the tomahawk was actually a sub-weapon, like a subset of the weapon family known as the war club. War clubs took on a variety of shapes and styles. Of course, there's the tomahawk, as we just talked about, but then other common types included the gun stock war club, named that way because it looked vaguely like the stock of a gun, and it often took on this sort of sword-like shape you see here, and would have either just the wooden club itself or would have one or more metal spikes or knives. You could actually debate whether or not they were a spike or a knife um, attached to them, or they would be war clubs like this that would be shaped sort of like a broadsword, if you will, or a long sword, and would be made completely of wood and would be used essentially sort of like a bat. After all, we can all imagine what being hit dead on by a solid wood bat would feel like. Others looked sort of like maces, like this war club you see here. And then also Cherokee warriors would wield knives. Uh, they did have metal knives before contact with Europeans. However, they were often made out of copper or bronze, which is not as sharp and doesn't last as long as iron or steel knives. And then, of course, they would also, prior to European contact, would use chert or flint knives. Chert and flint are the same thing, just called different names depending on the nation you're from. Uh, but of course, after contact with the Europeans, the Cherokee would adopt metal knives like you see here. And of course, during the 1800s, and really before in the 1700s as well, the Cherokee would adopt European weapons such as this musket you see here, perhaps a brown bess or, say, a European trade musket, and would also use uh, flintlock pistols, as you can see here. All right, now it is time to take a look at the government of the Cherokee Nation. The government of the Cherokee Nation prior to 1794 CE had no centralized authority. Each village or town was self-governing. Each town or village had its own council that would make decisions and resolve issues by coming to a consensus, and both men and women could speak in these councils. The chiefs were the heads of each village and village council. However, their influence would be limited to the democratic acceptance of their decisions by members of their village or town. Then, after the chief, would be the speaker, the individual who would inform the community of the chief's wishes. And then roughly as important, an individual who had roughly the same amount of authority as a chief would be beloved women, who were women who made significant impact within their community and exhibited great heroism on the battlefield. When a woman is bestowed as a beloved woman, she is given great honor and responsibility, such as Nancy Ward. Then you had the clan mothers, who were the heads of each clan, very important positions. And then you had war chiefs, who were respected warriors who held limited authority over the preparation of war and combat operations. After 1794 CE, the Cherokee Nation would centralize itself. One, they would create the position of the principal chief, who would become the top executive officer of the Cherokee Nation, who would be selected by the Cherokee National Council. The National Council would be a legislative body made up of each of the Cherokee Nation's regional and village councils, with this body meeting 6 to 8 times a year, and would be responsible for the election of the principal chief, the passing of laws, and decisions to go to war, among other things. Then you had the National Committee, which was the legislative body made up of 13 representative and experienced chiefs. This body would be responsible for guiding the nation between each national council and was responsible for managing the treasury, dealing with the United States Indian agents on a day-to-day basis, and would would call the National Council to deal with emergency issues. In 1820 CE, the Cherokee Nation would create a three-tiered judicial system, with this system being divided between the district courts, which hear all cases except for murder cases and civil cases of more than $100, then circuit courts, which would hear murder cases and civil cases involving more than $100, and the Supreme Court, which would hear appeals from the lower courts. And here are the sources I used to gather all this information. Then, within that same vein, we need to look at the criminal justice system in the Cherokee Nation. One, the clan would be in charge of punishing lawbreakers. Women, as leaders of the clans, would maintain the principle of retaliation is their own authority in politics. Prior to 1808 CE, murder was usually dealt with by revenge as part of the traditional blood law. However, in 1808 CE, prominent Cherokee politicians such as Major Ridge abolished the blood law system. Stolen property was usually punishable by returning stolen goods or other compensation. However, theft would later be punishable by a whip. Acts such as adultery would be punished by whipping or the cutting off of ears. However, men would punish women more often than women would punish men. Incest would be considered a crime. And then in 1818 CE, prominent Cherokee politicians such as Major Ridge and John Ross would pass laws making it illegal to sell any more Cherokee land to the United States. And then the Cherokee Nation during the early 1800s would create the Light Horse Brigade, which was a mounted police force responsible for keeping the peace, enforcing laws, expelling white intruders, and preventing both the theft of horses and cattle. And then here are the sources I used to gather this information. Now we need to talk about a very important individual and event that heavily influenced Cherokee society during this period of time. Sequoyah. Specifically, Sequoyah's creation of the Cherokee syllabary, which would enable reading and writing in the Cherokee language. Now, I do need to point out that many Cherokee could read and write and say English and other languages, and obviously they could speak the Cherokee language, but prior to that, there had, other than petroglyphs and pictoglyphs, there is a difference. There was no readily accessible, if you will, Cherokee writing, at least until Sequoyah created it in 1821 CE. Now this brings us to what Cherokee villages looked like during this time period. So both before and after your contact with Europeans, Cherokee villages looked something generally like this. They had houses that were made out of logs that were oftentimes covered in wattle and daub, or stucco, if you will, and had thatched roof houses. But in addition to that, after contact with Europeans, the Cherokee people would begin to adopt European and American United States style log cabins. They would also begin to adopt American-style buildings such as blacksmiths and taverns. And then after the invention of the Cherokee writing system by Sequoyah, the Cherokee Nation would be able to create a national newspaper known as the Cherokee Phoenix in 1828 CE. Now we go to look at the economy of the Cherokee Nation. So the economy of the Cherokee Nation was traditionally based on crops such as corn, beans, and squash, with corn being the main export of the Cherokee Nation, which is actually shown in the 1835 census of the Cherokee Nation, as described by historians William McLaughlin and Walter Concert Jr. And you can see that here in these graphs here, looking at, say, for example, the amount of corn sold by the Cherokee Nation in 1835 being almost 120,000 bushels. And you can see similar estimates here in these graphs here. And then, of course, the Cherokee would also harvest wild plants such as blackberries, plums, and hickory nuts. And they would hunt animals such as deer and wild turkey, while also harvesting various types of fish. Archaeological evidence also suggests that there was some degree of large-scale ritual feasting of toads and frogs in pre-contact Appalachia, as discussed by Thomas R. White and Matthew Compton in this paper titled "Explaining Toad Bones in Southern Appalachian Archaeological Deposits." And in this, he specifically focuses on these archaeological sites you see here. And when looking at these archaeological assemblages, specifically the animal remains, it becomes very apparent that some of actually the most common animal remains at many of these archaeological sites, especially Coweta Creek, were the remains of anurans, or what you would call frogs and toads. And again, you can see that here. Also, while looking at these frog and toad remains, White and Compton found that there was generally, as a rule, a lot more frog limbs and bones from the frog or toad's body, axial remains, than there were head remains. Now, of course, there was some variation to that, as you can see here. For example, Window Well had had a large degree of head remains. Um, and you can see that again in these graphs here. However, when looking at all of the sites, there was, even with that large amount of head remains found at the Window Well site, uh, see your limb, when looking at all the sites together, limb and body remains far outnumbered the head remains. And again, you can see here that Window Well has a lot more head remains than Coweta Creek. But again, that still makes up a small percentage of the head remains found, i.e., the head remains make up a small percentage of the frog remains found, with limbs and body remains greatly outnumbering them. When looking at all of these remains, for one thing, White and Compton conclude that, well, yes, sure, the window well experiment suggests that the bones of toad and frog heads would be less likely to be preserved, recovered, or identified. However, the fact that the many of the assemblages were so extreme and were heavily restricted to toads that contained toxins within their heads, that essentially these toads and frogs uh, were likely, say, for example, collected from springtime breeding aggregations using nets and then beheaded and skinned at the collection site to facilitate their transport back to the village, where they would then be feasted on, uh, and that therefore the remains found at Coetta Creek and Warren Wilson and uh, see and Window Well and such were associated with uh, feasts or rituals, possibly associated with the construction of a palisade. After looking at all of these frog remains at sites such as Window Well, one, White and Compton acknowledged that the Window Well experiment certainly indicated that the bones of the heads of frogs and toads would be less likely to be preserved and recovered and or identified. However, uh, as some assemblages were extreme and more restricted to toads that contained toxins in their heads, uh, that it was more likely that these toads and frogs were collected um, from springtime breeding aggregations using nets to catch them in puddles and ponds, and that the toads were probably beheaded and skinned at the collection sites to facilitate their transport back to the villages, with toad bones found in feature 65 at Coyote Creek and feature 229 at the Warren Wilson site, possibly representing uh, meals such as feasts or ritual meals associated with the construction of palisades, with feature 65 dating to the initial occupation of Coetta Creek, um, and feature 229 at Warren Wilson being interpreted as a daub processing pit, also associated with the palisade, and that palisade construction may have been undertaken in the spring when the soil was softened by heavy spring rains, which facilitated easier post hole excavation, and that toads and other foraged foods may have provided a ready source of meat that could have been procured by foraging parties, including children, while the able bodied adults were constructing the palisade. That being said, numerous toad remains recovered from the Smokemont site were actually primarily found in midden areas around the central hearth of a structure, whereas those recovered from the Ravensford site occurred primarily in assortment with pit features, both of which indicate that toads may have also been consumed indiscriminately whenever they were available for capture. Um, and then, but again, consumption of toads at the five southwestern North Carolina sites may have also been associated with ritual. This is suggested by numerous toad bones recovered from the earthen bench of an earth lodge, arguably a ritualized context at the Garden Creek Mound, mound number one specifically, with the hydric staining observed on the bones and the lack of head bones indicating that headless skinned toads were placed on the bench as an offering, uh, and that archaeologists such as Klassen and their 2014 paper, arguing that the toad remains in Feature 65 at the Coweta Creek site may represent a rain or fertility ritual deposit, presumably on the basis that such rituals were also practiced in Mesoamerica and in the larger Mississippian cultural region. But since toad remains are not particularly common on Mississippian sites outside of the Appalachian summit, ritual influence by way of cultural eddies of Mesoamerica and the greater Southeast are unlikely. And there is also no reference to ritual significance of toads in the ethnohistorical writings describing the native Southeast, only a recipe for their preparation and consumption by the Cherokee. Furthermore, all of the sites mentioned in the Appalachian Summit post-date 1200 CE, and most of them contain Pishka or Qualla period phase components, suggesting the toad consumption was common among pre- and post-contact Cherokees in the region. Toad remains are few on contemporaneous late Mississippian, specifically Dallas phase and Overhill and Tuckaleechee sites in to the west of the Valley and Ridge Province of East Tennessee, and on late woodland and contact period sites on the Carolina Piedmont to the southeast. This geographical restriction of more intensive toad consumption does not appear to be correlated with natural toad abundance, but rather with subsistence ethnicity. And that pre-Pishka phase faunal assemblages of sufficient size for comparison in the Appalachian summit are very few, and they include middle woodland period Conestee phase remains from the Garden Creek Mound, specifically Mound number 2, and the Biltmore Mound and Village site, with these assemblages dating between 400 and 800 CE, and the assemblage from Garden Creek Mound number 2, including only roughly 1,500 specimens, toad specimens. And also it was poorly preserved, and it was recovered using mostly 6.4 millimeter mesh, and it contained no amphibian remains. The assemblage from the Biltmore Mound was very was very well preserved, and it was recovered by finer meshes and flotation. Of the almost 35,000 specimens analyzed, only 127 or 0.4% were toad and frog remains. How the Biltmore assemblage, however, was recovered almost exclusively from the mound, and toad remains may have been more regularly deposited in pit features, such as those at Coweta Creek. If the consumption of large numbers of toads was necessitated only by village populous construction activities in the spring, when toads are obtainable in greater numbers due to their breeding habits, toad remains would be fewer on earlier sites lacking palisades. In conclusion, rather than the consumption of toad meat, regular consumption of toad meat may have been limited to specific ethnic groups of the southern Appalachian region, such as the Upper Cherokee. So, in sum, the Cherokee, both in the pre-contact and post-contact period, at least some villages participated in large-scale feasting, both ritually and communally, of frogs and toads. After contact with Europeans, the Cherokee would adopt pig domestication, which was interesting because, for one thing, as we discussed for say and the Muscogee Creek and Choctaw Nation videos, several Native American nations, after contact with the Europeans, adopted the cattle industry. And while yes, the Cherokee did adopt some cattle, they actually adopted the pig domestication in greater numbers than the cattle industry, as they viewed both pigs as both a valuable food source and a trade commodity, which is evidenced, for one thing, by masks, Cherokee masks, uh, carved in the shape of pigs, and also by censuses showing the sale of these animals, again, as discussed by William McLaughlin and Walter Conser Jr., with, as you can see here, the sale of pigs far outnumbering the sale of, say, horses and cattle and even sheep, really starting to do that in 1809. Though, of course, in 1809, as you can see here, cattle and pigs were being sold in roughly equivalent numbers. But this would be shift greatly by as early as 1826, where we begin to see um, cattle, pig sales more than doubling cattle sales, and that would stay relatively constant up until 1828 and presumably after. And again, you can see similar numbers in these graphs here. And also in these graphs here, as discussed by Wilma Dunway in Rethinking Cherokee Acculturation, Agrarian Capitalism, and Women's Resistance to the Cult of Domesticity, where again you can see hogs far outnumbering the sale of cattle, and see that here as well. And as I said in earlier in the video, the Cherokee Nation was a major participant in the deerskin trade between the early 1670s and early 1800s CE, with the deerskin trade making up a good chunk of the Cherokee Nation's economy, which is discussed heavily by historians such as John Bernard McCrow, who discusses the subject in his dissertation titled Cherokee Households and Communities in the English Contact Period, uh, where you can see that the Cherokee were by far the largest distributor of deerskins to European ports, European colonial ports, such as Charleston, which you can see in this graph here, these graphs here, this graph here, all of which show that the Cherokee Nation far outcompeted the other Native American nations of the eastern woodlands in terms of the deerskin trade. Then, as contact between Europeans and Americans and the Cherokee Nation continued to increase, the Cherokee Nation would adopt plantation farming and African American chattel slavery, which was adopted by many prominent Cherokee families, which is shown in the 1835 Cherokee census, again, as discussed by William McLaughlin and Walter H. Conser, with many of the prominent Cherokee families who owned enslaved African Americans, including prominent Cherokee politicians such as Major Ridge, his son John Ridge, John Ross, and James Vann. And this leads me to a subject that I've discussed several times in the previous videos, and that is something that I absolutely need to drive home. The Cherokee treatment of enslaved African Americans was every bit as brutal as the treatment by the United States, by white Americans. Far too often I have heard, and I and other historians and archaeologists have heard, when we work in context with Native American sites connected to Native American nations, such as the Muskogee Creek Confederacy and the Cherokee that, oh, the treatment of enslaved African Americans must have been better because they were enslaved by Native Americans. No, no, it's the furthest thing from the truth. Cherokee enslavers, such as James Vann, were notorious for their brutal treatment. James Vann, particularly, who was known for doing all of the same things that white American enslavers did to enslaved African Americans, brutal lashings, beatings. James Vann would hang enslaved African Americans. He would shoot them, all kinds of things. And this was something that was common with other Cherokee enslavers and white American enslavers. This is not, of course, this does not justify the atrocities committed against the Cherokee at the hands of the United States, but it also does not justify the treatment of enslaved African Americans by Cherokee enslavers. We can't just give Cherokee enslavers a pass. Uh, we have to give them as much derision as we have given white American enslavers, while also acknowledging that, again, this does not justify the brutal genocides and atrocities committed against Native Americans, including the Cherokee, by the United States. Then in 1801 CE, another adoption of American and European culture by the Cherokee began when prominent Cherokee politicians such as James Vann gave Moravian missionaries permission to build mission schools and churches within the Cherokee Nation, which allowed Moravian missionaries to make successful inroads into the Cherokee Nation, with the first of these being built in 1801 CE. Now this leads us to our next section, the Cherokee Nation and Indian removal. Starting with the election of longtime enemy, both politically and militarily, of the Cherokee Nation and all Native Americans, Andrew Jackson, who would be elected to the office of President of the United States in 1828 CE. Just a few months after his election to president, the Western Cherokee Nation would cede its lands in Arkansas and return for land in Oklahoma, Indian country, in the Treaty of Washington on May 6, 1828 CE. Then just 1 year after this, in 1829 CE, gold would be discovered in what is now Dahlonega, Georgia, a parcel of land that was actually in the Cherokee Nation at the time. And this would lead to the Georgia Gold Rush, and would lead Georgia politicians such as Mirabeau Lamar to begin demanding for the federal government to expel the Cherokee from Georgia, while at the same time, Georgia gold miners were consistently forcing Cherokee families from their homes. Then, in 1824, then in April 24th, 1830 CE, Andrew Jackson's Indian Removal Act would be passed by a narrow vote of 28 to 19 in the Senate and 191 to 97 in the House of Representatives. This was a highly contentious bill. Many prominent northern United States politicians were against Indian removal. Many prominent southern United States politicians were against Indian removal, including Sam Houston, who would eventually become the first president of Texas, and Davy Crockett. Also, several very influential religious groups were against Indian removal, such as the Moravian missionaries. But unfortunately, the bill passed. The Cherokee Nation would go on to challenge Indian removal in two court cases, the first being the Cherokee Nation versus Georgia case on March 5th, 1831 CE, which they would lose, with the federal court stating that the federal government could not stop Georgia from enforcing their laws. But the Cherokee, with the help of white missionary Samuel Worcester, won a second case known as Worcester v. Georgia on March 3rd, 1832 CE, which ruled that while, yes, the federal government can't stop Georgia from enforcing their laws, Georgia's laws, quote, it can have no force in the Cherokee Nation. That being said, Andrew Jackson would completely ignore the court's ruling, and his landslide re-election in 1832 CE would embolden calls for Cherokee removal. Then, after Jackson's second election, Georgia would begin selling Cherokee lands to its citizens in a land lottery between 1832 and 1834 CE. While all this was happening, the Cherokee Nation would begin to divide into two conflicting parties, led by Major Ridge and Principal Chief John Ross. With John Ross and his faction consisting of the majority faction of Cherokee, who heavily opposed removal west. And Ross and several prominent Cherokee politicians made this opinion very apparent to Andrew Jackson and the United States government in several letters, such as the letter sent by John Ross, Richard Taylor, Danny McCoy, Harry Conrad, and John Timpson to President Andrew Jackson on March 28th of 1834 CE, an excerpt of which I will read now. And this excerpt states, and I quote, "We were then your friends, and the conduct of a man is an index to his disposition. Now in these days of profound peace, why should the gallant soldiers who in time of war walked hand in hand through blood and carnage be not still friends? We answer that we are yet still friends, that we are yet your friends, and we love our people, our country, and the homes of our childhood, the childhood of our departed sires. We have ever enjoyed the rights and liberties of free men, and God forbid that we should ever live in vassalage to any power. And if we are too weak to live as free men, it is easier to die than to live as slaves." So as you can see in this letter, John Ross and the majority faction of the Cherokee made it very apparent that they saw Andrew Jackson's Indian removal as a betrayal. After all, the Cherokee Nation had been a longtime ally of the United States through the 1820s and 1830s, and had been a military ally with the United States during the War of 1812. As John Ross put it, they walked hand in hand through blood and carnage, yet Andrew Jackson was betraying them. And that is why, one of the main reasons why John Ross and the majority faction opposed removal to the West. Major Ridge is a much more complicated case, and this is because he had long been opposed to U.S. government proposals for the Cherokee to sell their lands and move west of the Mississippi. However, Georgia's efforts to suppress the Cherokee government and the pressure of rapidly expanding European American settlements caused him to change his mind and led him to come to believe that the best way to preserve the Cherokee Nation would be to get good terms from the U.S. government and preserve their rights in Indian territory. This was actually a fairly common opinion from people such as Major Ridge, whom were veterans of the Cherokee American War, the war that was fought between the Cherokee Nation and the United States, and were also veterans of the War of 1812. This was seen in Sequoyah, and the Bull, who were both veterans of these conflicts, as well as seen in Major Ridge. And so he made these changed opinions clear to the Cherokee Nation in a speech that he gave in December of 1835 CE, an excerpt of which I am going to read now. The excerpt reads, "I am one of the native sons of these wild woods. I have hunted the deer and turkey here more than 50 years. I have fought your battles. I have defended your truth and honesty and fair trading. The Georgians have shown a grasping spirit lately. They have extended their laws to which we are unaccustomed, which harass our braves and make the children suffer and cry. I know the Indians have an older title than theirs. We obtained the land from the living God above. They got their title from the British. Yet we are strong. Yet they are strong and we are weak. We are few, they are many. We cannot remain here in safety and comfort. I know we love the graves of our fathers. We can never forget these homes, but an unbending iron necessity tells us we must leave them. I would willingly die to preserve them, but any forcible effort to keep them will cost us our lands, our lives, and the lives of our children. There is but one path to safety, one road to future existence as a nation. The path is open before you. Make a treaty cession, give up these lands, and go over beyond the great Father of Waters." And here is the source I got this speech from. Unfortunately for Major Ridge, the Cherokee Nation, the majority of the Cherokee Nation, led by John Ross, would disagree with this, with Major Ridge's opinions. Eventually, because of this, Major Ridge and the Ridge Party would go on to sign the Treaty of New Echota, stipulating terms and conditions for the removal of the Cherokee Nation on December 29th, 1835 CE. And in return for this, for their lands east of the Mississippi, the Cherokee Nation was promised a large tract of land in Indian Territory, $5 million and $300,000 for improvements on their new lands. Major Ridge is reported to have said after he signed this treaty that he had, "I have signed my own death warrant." And this is because, as you remember earlier in the video, Major Ridge, along with John Ross, was one of the people who made it illegal in the Cherokee Nation to sell more Cherokee land to the United States. Then, after this, the Ridge Party and 2,000 Cherokee would then migrate west to Indian Territory. Now, I am not a member of the Cherokee Nation. It is not my place to pass judgment on Major Ridge. I will leave that to the Cherokee Nation and its citizens. Though that being said, I will state that looking at Major Ridge's life as a whole, as well as the events of what was, what was happening during this time period, the series of events that Major Ridge witnessed, I would say that with all that taken into consideration, Major Ridge's decision and his change of heart was at least understandable. Again, I'm not going to pass judgment on right and wrong. That is not my place, but I will state that it is at least something that we can understand as to why he came to these conclusions. Despite the signing of the Treaty of New Echota, Ross and over 15,000 Cherokee would insist that the treaty was invalid. However, despite that, the United States Senate would still pass the Treaty of New Echota by a one-vote margin and would enact it into law on May 1836 CE, with Andrew Jackson's successor, President Martin Van Buren, ordering 7,000 federal troops and state militia under General Winfield Scott into the Cherokee lands to evict the Cherokee Nation, officially giving this order on April 23rd, 1838 CE. Once Scott entered the Cherokee Nation, over 16,000 Cherokee would be forcibly relocated to Indian Territory in a forced migration known as the Trail of Tears, which happened between 1838 to 1839 CE. So this is the first of three sources we'll examine. This is by a source from Cherokee Lillian Anderson about the life story of her grandfather, Washington Lee. The source reads, in 1838, my grandfather, Washington Lee, came to the territory and stopped at Westville. He was driven from his home in Georgia over the Trail of Tears with all the other Cherokee Indians. While on the trail somewhere, he lost his father and mother and sister and never saw them anymore. He did not know whether they died or got lost. The Cherokee had to walk. All the old people who were too weak to walk could ride in the government wagons that hauled the food and the blankets which they were allowed to have. The food was most always cornbread or roasted corn. Sometimes the men who had charge of the Indians would kill a buffalo and would let the Indians cut some of it and roast it. The food on the Trail of Tears was very bad and very scarce. The Indians would go for 2 or 3 days without water, which they would get just when they came to a creek or a river, as there were no wells to get water from. There were no roads to travel over, as the country was just wilderness. The men and women would go ahead of the wagons and cut the timber out of the way with axes. This trail started in Georgia and went across Kentucky, Tennessee, and through Missouri into the territory and ended at Westville, where Old Fort Payne was. Old Fort Payne was built to shelter the Indians until some houses could be built. Aunt Chin Dinawash was my grandmother's sister, and she came from Georgia on the Trail of Tears. Her husband died shortly after they got out of Georgia and left her to battle her way through with 3 small children, one who could not walk. Aunt Chin tied the little one on her back with an old shawl. She took one child in her arms and led the other by the hand. The 2 larger children died before they had gone so very far, and the little one died, and Aunt Chin took a broken case knife and dug a grave and buried the little body by the side of the Trail of Tears. The Indians did not have food of the right kind to eat, and Aunt Chin came on alone and lived for years after this. And here's the source I got this account from. The second account that we are going to look at is, and I'm sure I'm going to butcher this, and I apologize, Wahaniao's account that reads, and I quote, perish or remove. It might be remove or perish. A long journey through the wilderness. Could the little ones endure? And how about the sick, the old people, and infirm? Could they possibly endure the long, tedious journey? Should they leave? This had been the home of their ancestors from time out of mind. Everything they held dear on earth was here. Must they leave? The graves of their kindred forsaken would be desecrated by the hand of white men. The very air seemed filled with an undercurrent of inexpressible sadness and regret. Some of the Cherokees remained in their homes, determined not to leave. For these soldiers were sent by Georgia and they were gathered up and driven at the point of bayonet into camp with others. They were not allowed to take any of their household stuff, but were compelled to leave as they were, with only the clothes which they had on. One old, very old man asked the soldiers to allow him time to pray once more with his family in the dear old home before he left it forever. The answer was, with a brutal oath, no, no time for prayers. Go, at the same time giving him a rude push through the door. Indians were evicted. The whites entered, taking full possession of everything left. And here is the source I got this account from. And then the next source is actually not an account of a Cherokee. It's actually the account of a soldier who who took part in the removal of the Cherokee from their homelands. Uh, but it's also, with that in mind, it's also an account of a soldier who um, was very much against the idea and hated the idea of the removal of the Cherokee people. And I will not read the whole account because it's rather large, but there will be several excerpts that I will read. Excerpt 1 reads, "One can never forget the sadness and solemnity of that morning. Chief John Ross led in prayer, and when the bugle sounded, the wagons started rolling. Many of the children rose to their feet and waved their little hands goodbye to their mountain homes, knowing they were leaving them forever. Many of these helpless people did not have blankets. Many of them had been driven from home barefooted. On the morning of November the 17th, we encountered a terrific sleet and snowstorm with freezing temperatures. From that day until we reached the end of the fateful journey on March 26, 1839, the sufferings of the Cherokee were awful. The trail of the exiles was a trail of death. They had to sleep in the wagons and on the ground without fire, and I have known as many as 22 of them to die in one night of pneumonia due to ill treatment, cold, and exposure. Among this number was the beautiful Christian wife of Chief John Ross. This noble-hearted woman died a martyr to childhood, giving her only blanket for the protection of a sick child. She rode thinly clad through the blinding sleet and snowstorm, developed pneumonia, and died in the still hours of a bleak winter night, with her head resting on Lieutenant Gregg's saddle blanket. I made the long journey to the west with the Cherokee and did all that a private soldier could do to alleviate their sufferings. When on guard duty at night, I have many times walked my beat in a blouse in order that some sick child might have the warmth of my overcoat. I was on guard duty the night Miss Ross died. When relieved at midnight, I did not retire, but I remained around the wagon out of sympathy for Chief Ross. At daylight, I was detailed by Captain McClellan to assist in the burial like the other unfortunates who died on the way. Her unconfined body was buried in a shallow grave by the roadside, far from her native home, and the sorrowing cavalcade moved on. Excerpt 2 reads, "Being a young man, I mingled freely with the young women and girls. I have spent many pleasant hours with them, and when I was supposed to be under my blanket, and they have many times sung their mountain songs to me, this being all they could do to repay my kindness. And with all my association with Indian girls from October 1829 to March 1839, I did not meet one who was a moral prostitute. They are kind and tender-hearted. They are kind and tender-hearted, and many of them are beautiful. The only trouble that I had with anybody on the entire journey to the west was a brutal teamster by the name of Ben McDonald, who was using his whip on an old, feeble Cherokee to hasten him into the wagon. The sight of that old, nearly blind creature quivering under the lashes of a bullwhip was too much for me. I attempted to stop McDonald, and it ended in a personal encounter. He lashed me across the face, the wire tip of his whip cutting a bad gash in my cheek. The little hatchet I had carried in my hunting days was in my belt, and McDonald was carried unconscious from the scene. Excerpt 3 reads, in one home, death had come during the night. A little sad-faced child had died and was lying on a bearskin couch, and some women were preparing the little body for burial. All were arrested and driven out, leaving the child in the cabin. I do not know who buried the body. In another home was a frail mother, apparently a widow, and 3 small children, one just a baby. When told that she must go, the mother gathered her children at her feet, prayed a humble prayer in her native tongue, patted the old family dog on the head, and told the faithful creature goodbye. With a baby strapped on her back and leading a child with each hand, started on her exile. But that task was too great for the frail mother. A stroke of heart failure relieved her sufferings. She sank and died with her baby on her back and her other 2 children clinging to her hands. Excerpt 4 reads, I can truthfully say that I did my best for them, when they certainly did need a friend. 25 years after the removal, I still lived in their memory as the soldier that was good to us. However, murder is murder, whether committed by the villain skulking in the dark or by uniformed men stepping to the strains of martial music. Murder is murder, and somebody must answer. Somebody must explain the streams of blood that flowed in the Indian country in the summer of 1838. Somebody must explain the 4,000 silent graves that mark the trail of the Cherokees to their exile. I wish I could forget it all, but the picture of 645 wagons lumbering over the frozen ground with their cargo of suffering humanity still lingers in my memory. Let the historian of the future day tell the sad story with its sighs, its tears, and dying groans. Let the great judge of all earth weigh our actions and reward us to our work. So, as you can see in the source, Private John B. Burnett um, was very well aware of the fact that he participated in a horrific act. He was very well aware of the fact that what he did was wrong completely, even as much as he tried to help the Cherokee. Even as much as he hated that this was happening. And acknowledges that he and others must answer for it. Now, as I said earlier, I am not a member of the Cherokee Nation. It is not my place to pass judgment over John Burnett, but I will say that at least he acknowledged his part in it and acknowledged that what happened was wrong and should never have happened to begin with. So, with that in mind, as the Cherokee marched along the Trail of Tears, they marched over 800 miles across Tennessee, Kentucky, Illinois, Missouri, and Arkansas, and would suffer from disease, exposure, and starvation, with as many as 4,000 Cherokee dying, which constituted nearly a fifth of their population. And here is the several various routes that they would go on. Now this leads us to the next section, the aftermath of the Cherokee Indian removal. So first off, it is important to note that not all of the Cherokee were removed. Several of them were able to escape. First, there were a group of 400 Cherokees who hid from federal troops in the remote Snowbird Mountains of North Carolina under the leadership of Solly. Then there were others who were helped by one of the white American politicians who opposed Indian removal, William Holland Thomas, who was specifically a white American store owner and state legislator from Jackson County, North Carolina. And he would help over 600 Cherokee from Quallatown obtain North Carolina citizenship, which would exempt them from forced removal. That meanwhile, while that was happening, the Cherokee Nation was surviving and reconstituting itself in Oklahoma Indian Territory. Then, as a consequence of the removal of the Cherokee Nation, in Texas, the former Georgia politician and now president of Texas, Mirabeau B. Lamar, would use Indian removal and his role in its passing as part of his justification for the defeat and expulsion of the Bowles Cherokee band that had broken off from the Western Cherokee Nation in Arkansas and had settled in Texas, with the Texas Rangers and Texas Militia defeating the Bowles Cherokee Band on July 15th, 1839 CE, in one of 4 removal era wars against Native Americans. Then, just days after the defeat of the Bowles band of Cherokee in Texas, a party of 25 Ross supporters would assassinate most of the Ridge family, including Major Ridge. Ridge's second cousin, Stan Wattie, would be the only survivor, fighting and surviving that day, and outfighting his attempted assassins, and escaping to Arkansas. With this happening on June 22nd, 1839 CE. Then, between 1861 and 1865 CE, the Cherokee Nation would side with the Confederate States of America during the American Civil War, partly because they wanted to get back at the United States for Indian removal, but mainly because, as I said earlier, the Cherokee Nation was a nation of enslavers, and they very much wanted to defend the institution of slavery. Yes, I am sorry, lost causers, but the American Civil War was most certainly fought over slavery. I'm sorry, but you got to deal with it. All right, this brings us to our last section, the Cherokee people today. So the Cherokee people continue to survive in three distinct Cherokee nations. The first of which being the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma, whose people continue to keep their culture alive despite previous and repeated attempts to destroy Cherokee and all Native American culture by the United States. The United Kituwa Band, also in Oklahoma, whose people are continuing to keep their culture alive despite previous and repeated attempts by the United States, and continued attempts by the United States to eradicate Cherokee culture and Native American culture. And the Eastern Band of the Cherokee in Western North Carolina, who again, despite previous and repeated continued attempts to destroy their culture by the United States, the people of the Eastern Band of the Cherokee are keeping their culture alive. All right, and this brings us to the end of our video. As I have said in the previous videos, I sincerely hope that you enjoyed the parts of the video that were about Cherokee society and culture. but I really, really do not hope that you enjoyed the parts about Cherokee Indian removal, Cherokee Indian removal, and the other atrocities that the Cherokee suffered at the hands of the United States. I know that is odd for me, the person making this video, to say, but the reason I am making these videos is not necessarily completely for entertainment. It is also for education, because much of this history has been outright ignored in the United States education system and ignored by the United States government as well. So I bring these subjects up because they are important things to learn about so that nothing like this ever happens to the Cherokee Nation or any Native American peoples ever again. So with that, I'm going to end this video. Remember to like, share, and subscribe. And if you want to see me cover any of the things I mentioned in the video in greater detail in later videos, please feel free to leave a comment in the comment section. And I hope you all have a good day.